Dark Side of the Ring Season 5. The subjects have been announced, and there is either 9 or 10. I've got 10, I think. So I'm going to read them out to you, and then I'm going to pick up one or two that I'd like you to get to talk about. Chris Adams is one of the big ones, because they've actually got the guy interviewed who killed him.
Wow.
So he's actually doing a sit-down talk interview about what sort of led to their scuffle and death and whatever. Next, Sensational Sherry, Terry Gordy, Black Saturday, Chris Colt, which is an interesting one because not too many people have heard about him. The Sandman, which I don't know. I don't know quite what that's going to be, unless it's that fight at Lou Albano's deal or something. I don't know. Earthquake, which I don't know how that's going to handle it. Either way, Harley Race. This has been suggested that this might be about the car crash that killed his pregnant wife and nearly severed his leg back in the 60s, I imagine. And the last two rounding it out is Brutus Beefcake. So probably the parasailing accident. And Buff Bagwell. I'm going to ask you about Chris Adams first. I don't know how much time you spent around Chris. He was in WCW for brief periods of time.
He was in UWF when I went down.
I'm sorry, he was in the UWF as well, of course. Yeah, so stories about Chris and why he otherwise might be in Dark Side of the Ring.
Yeah, we just use the phrase hothead, right? He had this 0 to 600 temper that would blow quite often. At the time, I wasn't aware of just how deeply into drugs he had gotten. But, and I can't say that I ever even saw him using drugs, or maybe I did. If I did, it was one of those things where it was so ubiquitous, you didn't just even pay attention to it because everybody was doing that. We were in a car one time, we being Davey Haskins was driving, my first partner, Ron Simmons, who, anybody that knows Ron, just love Ron. Ron's just a good dude. The UWF was a driving territory, sometimes 10,000 miles a week. And, crammed into this car, we all have shit tons of bags because we're on the road forever. And, Ron's got the front seat because he's the biggest of all of us. And, we all have bags behind us on our laps. Ron's got bags under his legs. And we're driving to northern Alabama or Louisiana, Jackson, Mississippi. And it's from where we were the night before, I think Baton Rouge. It's a long drive, 7, 8, 9 hours. It's a good long drive. And we're about a half hour into the ride, and Chris, he's just angry because we're all crammed in this car, and he's sitting behind Ron, and he hits the back of the chair. And Ron, being Ron, goes, hey, calm down, Chris. None of us are comfortable. He's got a long drive ahead of us. And this goes on, several more times. And finally, Ron draws a line in the sand and says, you hit the back of that chair one more time, we're going to pull this car over. And I'm sitting there watching Chris, and it was almost like he did it just to see if he was serious, right? He did it again. Ron looked at Dave, he goes, pull this car over. And he got out. He wouldn't fight Ron, but Ron threw all of his stuff out on the side of the road, and we drove away. That was the last I ever saw Chris Adams. He never made the building that night, and I never saw him again after that. It wasn't immediately after, but within the next year and a half, I guess. What year did he die?
Was it around 2000? I don't have that information, but it was around 2000.
Okay, so it would have been sometime later. But when I remember hearing it and thinking to myself, the circumstances surrounding it, it didn't shock me because, let's face it, Ron's a big guy, very easygoing guy, but certainly not somebody who wanted to keep poking to test. And, and then the lurid details of all the drug use and everything that started coming out. Chris had like a lot of the other great English wrestlers, right? Had a certain pedigree to him, just because of the accent and the style that he had learned over there and brought to America with him. He had far preceded a lot of the other guys. Finley's and a lot of those guys that had come over later and took it to a different level. But Chris was one of the first that I remember coming and you know, being so overtly British, and you know, that had an effect. And you know, let's face it, a good-looking guy. But when he turned into the heel role, it was almost like that was like the real him. You know, you started seeing this wasn't just the character he was playing out in front of the cameras. It was almost in a sense like how Brian Pillman did the loose cannon thing, right? Like just always on, always in character. You know, and you know, I always thought it was a shame because Chris, you know, was a darn good worker in the ring, and even at that time, before, like I said, years before I even heard anything about all the drug use, it seemed to me that he was so self-destructive. Like he would do these things that would get himself in trouble, knock down the card, suspended for a month, you know, these types of things. It was just this constant tripping himself up, tripping up his own career. And, but I do remember, like, the one thing, like, I guess on a positive note, when I first met him, he was one of the guys that Bill Watts had sent to Pittsburgh to run the shows that Dominic had run, where we ultimately had met Eddie Gilbert and Terry Tennant and all the guys. Chris was on that loop, and he always had an instant camera with him. And he was always taking pictures of the buildings and the dressing rooms. And I remember thinking to myself, like, we're in the dressing rooms every night. We're in buildings every night. And he said, because now this will help me remember. So he has like the visual. And I look back now and I'm thinking to myself, boy, I wish maybe I had not necessarily take a picture of every single building and everything, but you know, it's all now just a blur to memory because you didn't take time to, you know, to catalog any of that. So, but he was the first, and I think the only person I ever saw do that. You know, and I'm sure somewhere there's probably a lot of, you know, interesting and probably a lot of dull pictures laying around somewhere.